that would form around the house. So there were lesions of the skin that were called Tzaraas that needed to be checked and inspected, and from there, um, from there it became considered to be Tzaraas, and the person would have to go outside the camp. There was Tzaraas, there was the lesions of the clothing, but we're going to talk about the lesions of the house. That if somebody noticed a lesion of the house, what would they do and the impurity that would come of it? What is the message we're trying to learn from it? What is the lesson we want to walk away from? One is going to be learning how to use our words and how to certain techniques to have better speech and to avoid negative speech. You can't just say, don't talk bad about somebody else. You have to replace it with the positive and with the what you should focus on. Like when somebody says, "Hey, don't think about it," or ignore them, or get this, take this out of your mind. It doesn't work because of the psychology involved. You have to replace it with something else that you're going to focus on to avoid the negativity. So we're going to learn one of those techniques. And we're also going to learn something very important, specifically through Rashi, about how to take a negative experience or a negative situation and totally reverse it to the positive in general, as we're going to see here. So let us, here we go. Let us go straight to the text. I'm not going to read it verbatim. I'm going to paraphrase. I'm leaving it here on the screen. There's 2 pages of text, so we'll just summarize the first. One of the things that would happen if you noticed a lesion on the house is you would have to call a Kohen. In the translation, we call it a priest, but we know it means a Kohen, which means a descendant of Aaron. And the Kohen would have to come sometimes with an expert to examine the lesion. And depending on the colors and depending on the size and depending on the way it would grow, that would determine if it's considered tzaraas. Now, let me stress that any tzaraas that we're talking about, which is the leopard, which is this lesion, whether it's on the skin, whether it's on clothing, or whether it's on the house, like in our case, it's a spiritual thing. It's not a physical disease or a physical ailment. This is not leprosy. So we translate it sometimes as leprosy because we have no better way to explain it. But it was a spiritual lesion that would show up if there was negative talk, negative speech amongst the Jewish people as a way of reminding them and as a way of sort of punishing them that you have to improve your speech and separate yourself from the rest of the camp, from the rest of the people, because this is the only way now to understand in isolation to realize the division that you're causing. So it's a completely spiritual thing, and that's why we don't have it today, because spiritually we don't have that level of godliness revealed, which means we don't have that level of information that God reveals to us through these lesions. So when it came to the house, if the Kohen would determine that the lesion was in fact tzaraas, so what would have to happen is they would first empty the house before the Kohen would come. So that way everything in the house wouldn't become impure, as a way to protect all your valuables and not have to destroy them. So before the Kohen determines that it's tzaraas, you empty everything. And only then do you allow the Kohen to say, now it's tzaraas, as a way to protect the valuables of the people. Now, once the Kohen does that, you would have to destroy the house. If it's indeed tzaraas, you would have to destroy the house. And that was part of the way to rectify a lesion of the house. You couldn't just scrape out the lesion. You had to actually destroy the physical existence of the house and then rebuild it from scratch. And of course, there were a lot of different variables. It had to last for 7 days. It had to grow, and so on and so forth. And that would tell the Kohen and tell the expert who would tell the Kohen that this is a real lesion. This is tzaraas, and this needs to be destroyed. Now Rashi comes here and says something very important. I'm going to skip this last couple of verses. This is just elaborating on what we just spoke. But as we do every week, we focus on Rashi because Rashi is the hero of our class every Thursday night. So tonight as well, we are going to focus on Rashi. So Rashi quotes the Talmud, and he says over here that this is actually the lesion of the house was actually very good news. Because when the Israelites crossed the Jordan River and took over the land of Canaan, so there were many and the Rashi here specifically mentions the Amorites, the Amorim, Amoraim, which is in Hebrew Amoraim, in English Amorites, that they would conceal their treasures of gold in the walls of their home before they left, before they ran away from the Jewish people who were entering the land, thinking that they're going to be able to retake the land at some point. I know this sounds familiar. And if a house received this lesion, it was basically God's message to the person living in the house that if you knock the house down, you're going to find a treasure. And it was basically a way for God giving the treasure of the Amoraim to the Amorites to the Jewish people. So when somebody would see a lesion on the wall of their house, it was actually good news, or it was seen as potentially very good news, because once they would destroy their house, they would find that lesion. They would find that treasure. Now, why didn't they destroy the house in the first place? Because not every house had a treasure. So you didn't like to destroy a house and rebuild a house is not worth it just for the chance you might find a treasure. But if there was Tzaraas, it was almost as if God was telling the person that there's a treasure buried here and you have to destroy the house in order to find it. Now, the Rashi Rashi that's quoted here, there's a lot of questions and a lot of puzzling things that we have to bring up. The first and most obvious one is the Amoraim. The Amorites were not the only nation. There were 7 nations that lived in that land of Canaan that were conquered by the Jewish people. The Amorites were only one of them. So why does Rashi only mention them? Number 2, let's go to the source of where Rashi took this from. Here's a little visual to help us see that hidden treasure, or the potential for the hidden treasure. I'm sorry, it's not the Talmud, it's the Medrash, but I think the Talmud quotes it as well, though. But this is the Medrash that Rashi is referring to and simplifying for the 5-year-old in explaining the lesion of the house to the person learning the Torah. So this is what the Medrash says. And this I'm going to read. The Torah says, and I will place a lesion of Tzaraas. Rabbi Chia says, is being struck with a lesion on the house. I'm paraphrasing, a lesion on the house, a good thing, good news. So Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, the Canaanites heard that the Jewish people were coming to Israel, and they hid their money in the house and the fields because they didn't want the Jews to get it, and they thought they'll be able to return. So Hashem said, I promised their ancestors that I would bring their descendants into a land filled with good, as is written, and the house is filled with all the goodness. What did Hashem do? He afflicted the house with the lesions, with Tzaraas, and when the owner demolished the house, they found the treasure. So this is the source of Rashi, but Rashi changes it. One second, let's finish the Medrash. But who told the Canaanites that the Jewish people were about to enter the land of Israel? Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rav Nachman, says that Yoshua sent 3 letters of warning to them. Number 1, that if you want to vacate the land, you're welcome to vacate, and then you'll be able to leave peacefully and take your belongings with you. And number 2, if you want to make peace with us, we'll make peace and we can coexist. But number 3, if you want to fight, you could also do that. In other words, Yoshua let them know ahead of time that we're coming. So going back to the basics of this Medrash, what do we notice that's different about this and Rashi? Over here, the Medrash says that it wasn't just the Amorites, it was all of them. It was all the Canaanites, all the 7 nations. And number 2, it was all, not just their treasures and gold, but it was all their money that they hid there. Let's go back to the Rashi for a second. Look here how the Rashi paraphrases it, but very differently. This is because the Amorites concealed their treasures of gold. It doesn't say money, just gold in the walls of the home for 40 years. And Rashi adds in the Amorites. In other words, in the original source, it doesn't mention a specific nation. It just says the people that lived in Canaan. So why is Rashi changing the details here if he's quoting the Medrash? That's the $1 million question we want to answer. So let us understand a little bit about. Okay, so let's reframe those questions. Number 1, why does Rashi only single out the nation of the Amoraim and the Amorites when it came to those who hid the treasures? And number 2, Rashi mentions that they hid their treasures 40 years before the Israelites entered the land of Israel, while the rest of the nations hid their treasures right before they vacated. So why does Rashi mention that? And number 3, how did the Amorites know that they were coming 40 years before? And there's another question, which I'm not sure why it doesn't mention, but there's another question is, in the source that Rashi took it from, it mentions that they hid their money, not their gold, their money, everything. So why does Rashi single out golden treasures? So the basic understanding and explanation is that when the sea split, when the miracles of Egypt happened, of the 10 plagues and the sea splitting, that was a breakthrough of society that made headlines everywhere in the world. Because the idea that slaves could break free was impossible. It wasn't seen as a slave can never become a free person. A slave can never become an independent individual. Never mind from the superpower of Egypt, that was impossible. So that made headlines, and that allowed all of the people living in Canaan to realize, while these people that have miracles happening all around them are about to come to our land, so they kind of started making preparations to where to hide their wealth, where to hide their gold, their treasures. The Rebbe asks a very interesting question, which we're going to get to soon, but I want to bring it up here. The Rebbe asks a question: why didn't they just take their stuff with them? Why did they hide it in the walls if they realize that the Israelites are coming? They're probably going to win the war if there is a war. So why did they hide it in the walls? Why not just take it with them to wherever they're vacating to? The answer to that question is going to help us understand our lesson for tonight. So before we go further, let's understand something about the idea of Tzaraas, the idea of leprosy. And I want to give some background to it. So one of the first instances of leprosy that the Torah mentions is Moshe. When Hashem appeared to Moshe from the burning bush and said that go tell the people that the time has come and I'm going to redeem you and it's time to leave Egypt. So Moshe said, what if they don't believe me? Or he kind of made a statement that they won't believe me. And Hashem told Moshe to put his hand into his I guess, cloak, and it came out white as a temporary tzaraas, a temporary lesion, for the fact that he spoke negatively against the Jewish people, the fact that he assumed the Jewish people won't believe him. And for that, he was afflicted with Tzaraas. What's another more prominent example is Moshe's sister Miriam. When Moshe's sister Miriam in the desert said she felt bad for all the other prophets who had to separate from their wives during the prophecy because Moshe separated from his wife in order, while he was receiving prophecy from Hashem. So Miriam sort of spoke negatively against Moshe. So Hashem appeared to Miriam and Aaron at the time and said, everything Moshe did was based on what I told him to do. Please don't speak about my servant Moshe. And Miriam was afflicted with Tzaraas, and she had to wait outside the camp for 7 days. Now everyone waited for her, but she had to separate herself from the camp for 7 days. What is the idea of separating herself from the camp? Why is that the punishment for Tzaraas? And we had another class about this, but I'm going to summarize the message here. Is one of the powerful things about speech is that speech, we sometimes minimize the potential and minimize the impact that a word could have. When we say something to someone or about someone, we all see the effects and the impact that could have negatively with the way people will interpret it, the way people will spread it, and the way it could literally ruin somebody's life. Or not just that, it can lead someone to, God forbid, taking their own life. Speech is so powerful, and the reason why speech is so serious in Judaism is because it's so easy to minimize. Oh, I was making a joke, or I said something randomly. I didn't mean it. Come on, lighten up. It doesn't always come off in our minds the magnitude of what we're doing by speaking, and therefore the Torah is very, very strict in when it warns us about the words that we choose and how we speak. And the tzaraas, the lesions that would appear as a consequence of negative speech, specifically slander against somebody else, is that the punishment wasn't a painful lesion. The lesion didn't cause any pain, but what it required is that person would have to separate themselves. They would have to quarantine themselves and go into isolation, because the whole idea of negative speech is causing division. So they have to experience that division and understand the gravity of what they're doing in order to rectify their deeds and improve their deeds. And then at the end of the 7 days, the lesion would disappear, and that would basically allow the person to grow and learn from that mistake. So it wasn't a permanent punishment, it was a timeout for that individual to realize the division they're causing. So that being said, and since that's the theme of tonight's class, even though we're talking about the lesions of the houses and the positivity that came afterwards, but it was still all about that negative speech. So Rashi is trying to bring something different here, and not just the Medrash giving it. The Medrash is about giving us the backstory. Like, you read the Medrash and you want to know, like, the deep details, the things that between the lines, things that the Torah doesn't usually teach us, that you don't see in the Torah. But Rashi is about very specific to make sure we understand the simple explanation. So Rashi gives a very bit of a different quote from the Medrash, because he already mentioned in Exodus. This is from the Az Yashar, from the Song of the Sea, that the leaders of Edom were petrified of the Jewish people after hearing about the splitting of the sea. What does Rashi say? They said the Jews are coming upon us to annihilate us and take our possessions of our land. So Rashi already assumes that we know that the people in Canaan were scared of the Jewish people and were going to hide their possessions. So he didn't have to explain too much when he's telling us now that the legions of the house was a message of hope, because they would find the treasure when they would destroy their houses, the treasures that were hidden by the Amorites before they left. But it doesn't answer our question. So let us go into some. I'm going to skip this here for a second because we don't really have the answers yet. What we're going to do is we're going to look deeper into what the Amorites represent and why they buried their treasures 40 years early, and why they were also the poster child, so to speak, of the ones who hid their treasures. So the Rebbe says like this: once they saw that the Jews were delayed for a protracted period in the desert after the sin of the spies, they had to wait for 40 years, they had no reason to keep their money hidden. They would not worry about it until it became clear that the Jews would enter the land. So that's how most of the people of Canaan would act. Is, in other words, they didn't hide their treasures for 40 years. They waited till it was time for the Jewish people to enter, and for those 40 years, they were able to enjoy their money and their treasures. So what was really happening? The people of Canaan, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but the people of Canaan, the 7 nations, were not allowed to be kicked out of the land of Israel until they did something to deserve the consequence of being kicked out. And not all the nations were kicked out. The ones that didn't sin or didn't do anything wrong they coexisted with Israel. In fact, they lived in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem wasn't taken until King David, because God doesn't punish someone without a reason. So the Amorites knew that they had 4 generations until, in other words, based on their behavior from the past, they knew that they had 4 generations until it was their turn to be kicked out. In other words, they were very well aware of how God runs the world, and they were very well aware of the actions of their ancestors and their actions of their nation, and they knew how long they deserved to live in the land of Israel, and they knew when their time is up. And technically speaking, their time was up 40 years early. They were granted an extra 40 years because of the sin of the spies, but they already knew that the time was up, and therefore they hid their treasures 40 years early. Why does this matter? Hold on. So the Jews needed to wait to enter the land because the nations living there still had 4 generations of merit left before they became unworthy, and they needed to be kicked out. Not so with the Amorites. For the inequity of the Amorites will not be complete. In other words, they're needing to leave. They would not deserve to be sent out of their land until then. This is because God does not punish a nation until its measure is full. So if they had merits to live in the land of Israel, they would have materialized, and they wouldn't be able to be kicked out. I'm not going to get too deep into this, because what it's saying here basically is that they had ancestors who did good things, and the merits of those good things or the merits of those bad things, depending on the nation, they knew what their consequences or what their rewards were going to be. So the Amorites calculated effectively and accurately how long they deserved to live in the land of Israel. It's almost like when you have a lease. So you're paying the rent, or you have a contract that tells you you're allowed to live in this place, or you're allowed to do business in this place because of your lease. So too the Amorites knew what their lease was with Hashem, with God. They knew how long they had to live in the land of Israel. And therefore they buried their treasures early, because they knew when their time was up, and they knew that their time was up early. The other nations in the land of Israel, they knew that they had more time. So therefore they unburied their treasures when the Jews were delayed. So why does this matter? So I'm going to skip this text over here. Let me go straight to Maimonides. Why does this matter? Because the Amorites represent in spirit in Kabbalah, they represent one of the 7 nations of Canaan, 7 character traits. In the spiritual realm, everything that exists in the physical realm is a representation of what exists in the spiritual realm. And that's something that's a theme throughout the Torah. The 7 nations that lived in Canaan represent the 7 emotional character traits that we have in our physical body and we have in our existence. And the idea of conquering the land of Canaan and conquering the land of Israel is actually a spiritual thing of conquering our 7 character traits, our 7 emotions, and elevating them, uplifting them, harnessing them for positivity and serving God. What is the character trait of the Amorites? Amira. The word Amorites comes from the word Amar, Amira, which means speech. The Amorites represented the power, the character of speech, not bad speech, but speech. It turns out that they represented the bad part of the speech, but the point is a character trait isn't bad unless you use it negatively. So let's go further with the Rambam, and then we're going to break that down into the spiritual side. The change that affected clothes and houses, which the Torah describes in the general term Tzaraas, is not a natural occurrence. Instead, it's a sign of a wonder prevalent amongst the Jewish people to warn them against Lashon Hara, sinful speech. Tzaraas isolates the gossipers, making it known that they must remain alone to abstain from the conversation of the wicked, which are folly and harmful speech. Now, the Torah can't just tell us don't speak negatively about other people. That doesn't work because we're human. And how does it happen that we speak negatively about someone? We're in a conversation, we're having a little talk, we're at an event, we're at a networking event, we're at a party or at a wedding or at a bar mitzvah or whatever it is, and you're having a conversation, some person comes up and someone says something negative. It just happens. It's part of a chain of events. So what does the Torah teach us to do? So the Rambam gives us, and he is quoting Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, that there's a way to prevent it. This is the path that is followed by the gatherings of the wicked fools. They begin by speaking excessively about empty matters. Then they come to speak negatively of the righteous. Finally, they become accustomed to speaking against the prophets, causing aspirations on their words. Thus, the speech of the wicked is caused by loitering on the street corners, frequently assembling of commoners and spending time at the parties of the drunkards. The Rambam doesn't mince words here. And what he's saying here, practically and very practically, is the first thing we have to realize about avoiding negative speech is you can't put yourself in a situation that will lead to it. So if you're in a conversation and you could tell that it's about just random, and it's about what's called heva, like it's not bad. It's just like it's folly. It's like, something that's totally not considered to be holiness. You have to assume it's going to turn into negative speech about another person. And therefore, don't wait for that to happen, but stand up and leave the crowd before that happens. And the same goes for any other situation when it comes to where you're hanging out, if who you're having a drink with. All of these things, by the way, whatever situation you're putting yourself in, you kind of know, whether consciously or subconsciously, or whether you're willing to admit it or not, you kind of know the direction of where it's leading. And that's what the Rambam is saying, is that the first step is to avoid those situations that might lead you to negative speech.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so the last time I was someplace, we were sitting having lunch. It was during Shabbos at, Kiddush, and someone said something negative about someone at the table we were sitting at. What I did is I said something positive about that person, and they all agreed. So I changed the negative to the positive.
Kudos to you. That's exactly what you're supposed to do. And a Shabbos table is a good example, because a Shabbos table is meant to be a place of holiness. It's meant to be a place of Torah study, of positive speech. So listen, we're all human, so you can't, there's always a possibility somebody's going to try to insert something negative. But this is why Shlomo HaMelech says, and this is what's on the screen, is that sin is unavoidable when there are many words. In other words, the more somebody speaks, the more chatter there is, the more likelihood it's going to lead to sin. In other words, slandering somebody else. And the Torah is very clear and very in its guidance that generally speaking idly, randomly, or just randomly talking could very well lead to sinful speech.
Yeah, well, I share my story with people because maybe they would do the same thing if it happens, that they would turn the negative into the positive.
Absolutely. And that's what we're supposed to do. So now the Rebbe is going to give us even an additional tip here, because it's not just, you can't just, the Rambam is saying avoid situations that might lead to negative speech. But to your point, Sue, the Rebbe is going to give a positive spin, a transformational spin on how you could ensure that your speech is going to be positive. Because speech is an action, but what's most important to understand is speech is a result of what's in your thoughts. And now I share this story, this self-deprecating story here, but I share this very often, but I believe it's a very good example of this. So I was in camp. I was 13 years old. I was in a bunk that was for bar mitzvah boys in a sleepaway camp in Michigan. And my counselor was a very religious, a very, sincere, pure individual, a very good guy. He's actually the chief rabbi of Turkey now. He's the chief rabbi of the small Jewish community in Turkey. He was my counselor. And, during one of my conversations with some of the other campers in my bunk, a very bad word came out of my mouth. Okay? I'll leave it to your imagination to think of which bad word, but I wasn't the best kid. I wasn't, I wasn't the most well-behaved kid. In fact, probably just the opposite. So a very bad word came out of my mouth. And I didn't realize my counselor was there, but my counselor heard it. And, he had this little notebook. Those sports coaches who, when they see one of the players doing something wrong, you can see them writing a note that, they're going to deal with it in the locker room later. So my counselor had this little notepad, and instead he gave me this look, and he opened his notepad, and he, wrote a note. And it was like the worst thing that, because I knew how bad it was. And I immediately said, I just slipped out of my mouth, and it slipped. It slipped. It's totally an accident. He didn't say anything. Later on, and in his notepad, what he was writing is to make time to talk to me about it, right? So when it came time when he was talking to me about what slipped out of my mouth, he said something that I'll never forget. He said, I know it slipped. I didn't think you said it on purpose. In fact, I know you're absolutely right. It slipped. But been seeing and he starts mentioning the names of other campers who such a word would never slip out of the mouth. Out of this individual, out of this camper, that word would never slip because it doesn't exist in their vocabulary. It doesn't exist in their thoughts. Out of this camper, such a word would never slip because it doesn't exist in their thoughts. In other words, the only way that word could slip out of your mouth is if it exists in your thoughts. So the fact that whether it slips or doesn't slip is a complete result of if that word exists in your vocabulary. So what the Rebbe is saying here in text 9 is very similar, where in order for us to ensure that our speech is good, and to your point, Sue, again, is to focus on the positive, you have to start with your thoughts. Thought is a vehicle and a servant of intellect and emotions. Even when it does not serve intellect or feelings, it continues to function and think, because your thoughts never stop. And meditate. However, this activity is only devoid of content, but also open to depravity. Therefore, if you don't fill your thoughts with positive and Torah thoughts and good thoughts, your mind is going to go to other places. It's going to be full, no matter what. So you have to fill it up proactively and not allow it to just consume whatever comes to mind, and therefore potentially lead to negative thoughts. It is explained that alien or evil thoughts are caused by the mind's emptiness. That it doesn't happen because you're actively trying to find something negative to think about. It happens because you didn't put positivity in your mind. And if you didn't put positivity in your mind, then it's empty, and then it can easily absorb the negative thoughts. So it's not that you actively went to try to find something negative to think about, but if you leave your mind empty, then that's what's going to happen. When the mind is occupied, the thought has something to serve, and there's no room for stupid or vain thoughts devoid of substance. So what I've been saying here is that the key to positive speech is positive thinking. And the amount of books that have been written about positive thinking are endless. But generally speaking, it's keeping your mind busy proactively and intentionally with what you want your mind to be thinking. You're not going to get it perfectly. You're not going to always have it in the right way, but the more you do that, the less chance that your mind will have for negative thinking, and then eventually negative words as well. So the more you focus on the positive words, the more you focus on the positive thoughts, the more the positive words will come out, and the less negative words will come out. By the way, this is also true, in my opinion, and I'm not an expert, but this is what I believe true when it comes to depression and when it comes to self, I don't mean the depression, the disease. I mean the depressing feeling of self, like I'm not doing good enough, or doubt, or questioning yourself. The more you're busy, the more you're focused, the more you're preoccupied on what you have to accomplish, the less you have time to think about yourself, which means the less sad you're going to be. That's a very basic, understanding of how to be proactive and preemptive in focusing on keeping yourself busy on something outside of yourself and greater than yourself and better than yourself, and not giving yourself the time to think about how bad you might be or how empty you might be or how sad of a life you might have if you're focused on too busy on doing what you need to be doing. Okay, so now I think my wife tells the story. Somebody once apologized to the Rebbe after somebody once said something to the Rebbe that was considered to be offensive, and like a big rabbi in the early years of the Rebbe's leadership, and they wrote a whole apology letter, and they were basically saying, "I hope the Rebbe wasn't offended," and the Rebbe wrote back, "I don't have time to be offended." Like the Rebbe was basically saying, like, it's not a matter of if it was offensive or not. I don't have time to be offended. I don't have any time to think about if it's offensive or not. In other words, if you keep yourself busy with what you need to be doing, you don't have time for negativity. So now back to the Amorites, the Amoraim, they represented the character of speech. Now the character of speech, and here's the where that comes from. So Amorite, which is the Hebrew letters spell out Aleph Mem Resh, is very similar to the word Amida or Amar, which is speech. So the Amorites indulged and represented this idea of sinful speech, which is why they had to be conquered first spiritually, in a sense that you have to conquer your speech first in order to make sure that you don't have any negative speech, which is why Rashi quotes and highlights specifically the nation of Amorite, the Amorites specifically, because they were the ones who represented the character of speech, and they were the ones whose treasures were found after the lesions were found on the walls. Because why did the lesions come in the first place? Because of negative speech. So when there was negative speech, there was lesions on the walls to give you the treasures of the Amorites who represented negative speech. But wait a second. If getting Tzaraas on the house was because the Jewish person who lived in the house spoke negatively, why are they being rewarded with the treasures of the Amorites who represented sinful speech? Why is God rewarding the person who spoke negatively or evil about someone else or slandering someone else, which was the only reason why the Tzaraas, the lesion appeared in the first place? Why are they being rewarded with the treasures of the Amorites who also represent sinful speech? Why is the Jewish person better than the Amorite, or than the Amorite? So here's the Rebbe's answer. So I'm going to skip this over here because I want to, we'll come back to it, but I want to go straight to the Rebbe's answer. I'm sorry, I'm going to come back to this. Conversely, the hidden treasures of gold were found uniquely in the Amorite home. Why? Because the purpose of Tzaraas wasn't meant, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here because I'm excited about it, but what the Rebbe is explaining here is that the idea of Tzaraas wasn't meant to be a punishment and then move on. So when a teacher gives a consequence to his student for misbehaving or puts them in timeout, so sometimes a mediocre teacher will say, go to timeout and then come back, and that's your consequence and that's it. And then hopefully you'll be better behaved. But a really good teacher will use a consequence as a way to not just make the student not do what they did before, but make them even better. Use the consequence as a learning opportunity to make them even better than they were before. The purpose of Tzaraas was not to neutralize or prevent or to punish the wicked person for speaking badly, but it was to transform the human power of speech. So rather than negative speech, we should have words and conversations about holy topics. As Yaakov says, I snatched it from the Amorites. In other words, I transformed and elevated the speech of the Amorites in order to holiness. Words and speech that are good and holy reveal the hidden treasures of the soul. The idea of Tzaraas was to elevate and to take the negative action and turn it into the sin becomes a mitzvah by transforming the individual with the lesson in turning that speech into holiness, turning their future speech into holiness. In other words, the message of this whole incident happening was to teach the Jewish people that when you mess up and when you speak negatively about someone else, you're going to be punished because you need to be in isolation. You need to learn how to speak positively about other people. But know that within the destruction of your house, because of the slanderous speech that you spoke, that because of all that, you have the opportunity to transform and to elevate and to learn from it and discover the treasure that follows, the treasure of holy speech. And this is why Rashi focuses on the Amorim, on the Amorites, because they represented speech and they represented the potential of transforming speech into holiness. And that's why Rashi doesn't quote the Medrash talking about money that was hidden in the walls, but Rashi specifically changes the words to gold and treasures, because it's the treasure of transforming the negativity into positivity that they would find after the destruction of their homes as a consequence of their negative speech. What does this teach us? Because speech is something that could come so easily and naturally to anyone, and it could happen to anyone to speak negatively about someone else. As Sue mentioned, it happened at a Shabbos table. It happens to everyone. It could happen to everyone. So don't let that put you down that you are a bad person, or that, I mean, yes, you shouldn't have done it and you have to fix it and you have to, face the consequences, but it also comes with this opportunity of destruction that has a treasure beneath it. Whenever we're faced with a negative character or a negative character trait or a negative action or a negative deed or something that we need to overcome, the Torah is teaching us specifically that within the destruction that we deserve, we're also going to find the treasure of the transformation that comes from it. And this is why Rashi zeroes in on the gold and the treasure and zeroes in on the Amorites versus all of the 7 nations, because this is specifically focused on the speech. Let's go back to what the Antidote says here, because that's an important tactic in ensuring our speech is correct. So the Antidote says in one of his Hasidic discourses, that Amorite represents aimless chatter and foreign thoughts in Israel. Remember, it's not necessarily evil. It's just foreign. In other words, it's not holy speech. So speaking too many words indicates, as the Zohar says, indicates stupidity or indicates vain. And really, the real translation would be vain. The Amorite represents energy that hails from the wrong side, the side of impure energies that disturb Israel. So the Amorite do not merely drive us to aimless talk, they also drive us to foreign thoughts. So all speech begins in the heart, and with the mind thinking mindless thoughts that are foreign to Jews because they don't belong to God. The word Amorite, which is the current tense, which is in the current tense, implies constancy, which refers to the energy of the mind of just empty thoughts that drive us to empty chatter. So the ancient, insane king traps us into thinking foreign thoughts and speaking empty words, for sin is the inevitable companion of too many words. So what do we do? How do we overcome that sense that we're trapped in this, that we have no choice, that any thought that's not holiness is going to immediately lead us to negative words? So we must remove this power from the Amorite by deliberately avoiding foreign thoughts and empty words. We have to counter that with positive thoughts. Instead, we must constantly think godly words and godly thoughts. Going to the next page here. Wait. I think it cut us off because there's another paragraph here, but we must think godly words and godly thoughts and utilize those to fill our minds and fill our words to avoid the negativity. So that's what the Antidote teaches us as a tactic to avoid the negative language. Now, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot that we learned this past Shabbos tells us that I was raised amongst Torah scholars, and one of the things that I learned is that there's nothing more valuable than silence, because speech could ultimately lead to sin. Now, very important, this doesn't mean silence of everything, because if you have an opportunity to speak, to educate, to teach positivity, you have to do that. The idea of silence is silence from just random idle chatter. The Talmud also gives a metaphor that a word costs you 1 coin, but silence is valuable or value double because you're avoiding the possibility of negative chatter. And then Rambam brings us home here by saying that in contrast, speech of proper Jewish people is always focused on words of Torah and wisdom, and therefore Hashem helps us when we try to be proactive and fill our minds with positive thoughts and positive energy and positive, which will lead to positive words. Hashem helps us and gives us the merit in order to avoid the negative thoughts. And what is that? That's the treasure that we find after the destruction. What's important to the part that I take over here, before we go on to the summary, is number one. Once again, I have to always say this, but the way that Rebbe sees those minor little details in Rashi, the little differences that the Rashi says that from the source, from when it's sourced from the Medrash differently, and the way that Rebbe understands what Rashi is trying to teach us with this message specifically related to the speech, the character of speech, and the treasures that follow, versus the way the Medrash sums it up, is just brilliant. But ultimately, the lesson here is that whenever there's a bad situation, a situation where we are guilty of something, or we did something wrong, or we made a mistake, what Rashi wants us to know from the idea of an Amorite is that there's always a treasure after the destruction. That within every destruction, there's always a treasure. It doesn't mean we're always going to find it. It doesn't mean, because you have to work for it, but there always is that treasure, and we should never give up hope as if this is, just the consequence. We have to suffer through it, get through it, and then we move on with our lives. That's not what it's about. It's that within the destruction itself, within the pain itself, within the consequence itself, there's a treasure that is greater than what we had before, in the sense that it leads us to greatness. It leads us to a whole new set of open doors that we didn't have before, specifically within the consequence. So we should never look at a consequence or a painful experience or anything else that we have to face as the end, or as the punishment, because there's always a treasure hidden there. Please don't ask me to explain that in modern tragedies and suffering, because I can't, or in horrific things that happen in the world. I can't do that. I'm not God. But at the same time, what Rashi is trying to do is teach us that even if it's something that we've done, that we've caused, a mistake that we've made, is that we should never give up hope, and we should always try to find that treasure. And that's what the Rebbe here is bringing out. So our key points is, number one is Tzaraas in the house was good news because it told the person that there's probably a treasure that's hiding in the house that needs to be discovered. And ultimately, the greatest treasures were discovered when a person did something bad, or they slandered someone else, but they were discovered because of the destruction that followed, which was a learning opportunity for that person to become even better and greater than they were before, and that's the treasure that was discovered. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone. May the transformation happen, and may it be revealed, and may it not just happen to us, to each individual, but should happen to us as a community, and for the entire Jewish people with the coming of Mashiach.
Thank you. You know what? I wanted to say that tonight's lesson could also be included to ourselves, not to say negative speech about ourselves.